Coping with fine grain. As you probably all know, there are lots of constructions where you can substitute necessary equivalence and apparently get changes in truth value or no guarantee of the same truth value. And even substitute logical equivalence and not get the same truth value, right? You can believe one logical truth without believing them all. You can reject one logical impossibility without rejecting them all. And so once we recognize that, and especially if we want a kind of semantic story about how our language works so that it's sensitive to something more than, say, the possible world's intention of the expressions we're using, natural question comes up is how fine-grained do we need to be? What substitutions, if any, are allowed? If you've got two different words, can they ever be substitutable in all sentences in which they appear with a guarantee of sameness of truth value, or even sameness of proposition, or sameness of truth condition? And I'm starting to think that our language has to be very fine-grained indeed if the standard is substitutable everywhere. If the standard for strict synonymy is substitutable everywhere, salvo veritate, or at least everywhere where this word is used in a sentence of a language. And so first, I want to try to convince you that it looks like we will need very fine-grained semantic values, very fine-grained semantic differences between words that you might have thought were very closely connected. And then what to do about that? So flat-footed response, and then objections to the flat-footed response, and then an attempt to kind of say where I think we should go in light of those objections. So some of this will be old news, especially to this group, but there are various constructions, say in English, where substitution of necessary equivalents don't work. So one very easy version is so intensional transitive verbs. So some transitive verbs like kick, right? If I kick a ball, I kick anything which is identical to that ball. But there are intensional transitives where it seems to do something to do with representation or something like that. So seeking, right? I can seek the 7 cities of gold without seeking a talking squid, even if there are no cities of gold and no talking squid, right? It's like hoping or fearing, right? You can fear one thing without fearing another. And I think this is true even for necessary equivalence. Like, I mean, some people think if there's no El Dorado, there can't be an El Dorado, if you like a sort of Kripkean referential picture. But even if you thought that, I could be seeking a proof of some mathematical conjecture without seeking every proof of every necessarily equivalent conjecture. And I could be seeking one where it's impossible for there to be such a proof without seeking every impossible proof, or hoping that it turns out that blah, where blah is some logical sentence or some sentence in metaphysics or theology, and not thereby hoping every necessarily equivalent to blah. Especially if blah turns out to be impossible, I don't thereby hope for every impossible thing. For that matter, I can hope for some necessary thing. I can be in a good situation without thereby hoping for every necessary truth. One area that's been discussed an awful lot is sort of, at least in metaphysics, sort of explanation and grounding in particular, whether grounding is explanation or supposed to underpin it or whatever. But a lot of people think that, at least when you're considering it sort of propositionally, that P grounds that Q, it's got to be hyperintensional. You can ground something without grounding all of its necessary equivalents. And one stock example, which is, all the examples are controversial. A lot of people think that it's not the case that roses are red. That's necessarily equivalent to roses being red, but it's not the case that roses are red is grounded in the fact that roses are red. It's sort of roses are red plus how negation works or something like that is the satisfying logical explanation of why it's not the case that roses are red. But that shows, if that example works, that it's not the case that roses are red just has a different semantic value from roses are red, because we can't, well, this is an extra assumption, but some people think that roses are red does not explain that roses are red, right? That it doesn't ground that roses are red. Grounding is at least often not reflexive. Some people think it's irreflexive, that there are no reflexive cases. So if you accept that example, then that's an example where you need to distinguish the meaning of it's not the case that roses are red from the meaning of roses are red, so that not P can be grounded in P without P being grounded in P, right? You can't just sort of substitute and preserve truth. Another classic example that even a lot of the people who really like possible worlds intentions are also tempted by is the idea that something can be knowable a priori without a necessary equivalent of it being knowable a priori. You can know a priori that if there's any water, water is water, without knowing that if there's any water, water is H2O. You can know that a priori, you can be a priori certain that Hesperus is Hesperus without being a priori certain that Hesperus is phosphorus, right? Kripke taught us blah, 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 right? So those are cases where people want to say, no, look, there can be necessary equivalents where they have to be meaning something different because they embed differently, and Jim knows a priori that. That's just a construction. I mean, I guess in philosopher's English, but philosopher's English is English too, and that substituting necessary equivalents in the scope of Jim knows a priori that can change truth value. Okay, so if those are the only cases you're thinking about, you might be fairly confident that we can still have a lot of successful substitution salva veritate, or to put it another way, strict synonymy between a bunch of expressions, right? So people faced with a knowable a priori developed two-dimensional semantics and sort of what's picked out, and anyway, I won't go into the details, but they thought you could do it basically with pairs of possible worlds. Grounding, people are kind of hopeful that they can have a pretty rich logical structure to, or rich model theory that where lots of expressions pick out the same thing, and so they are grounded by and ground all the same things, even if it cuts so finely that not P and P are not semantically equivalent. That is, don't have the same semantic value. But I think if we look a bit further, we can find lots of cases where it seems even less well-behaved than that. So I should stop and say what I mean by one theory postulating finer-grained semantic values than another. Basically, I take the test to be something like substitutable salva veritate, or substitutable guaranteeing the same truth value, or something in the vicinity. And you have finer-grained semantic values than me if I accept all the substitution salva veritate cases that you do, and I accept some extra ones. So the person who thinks that every semantic value is a possible world's intention, at least the classic version of that, necessary equivalence is sufficient for them for substitutivity salva veritate. At least the flat-footed version of that, they want to say, no, if you're searching for El Dorado, you're searching for anything necessarily equivalent to El Dorado. If you're searching for a proof that a proof of a conjecture that has no proof, you are searching for a proof that 1 + 1 is 3. That's just, they can't be one of the first, they can't be one of the second, so they necessarily have, those two descriptions necessarily have the same extension. So that flat-footed version counts a lot as semantically equivalent. Even more flat-footed would be the extensionalist, where any two truths are substitutable salva veritate in any context, right? The extensionalist has kind of two semantic values for sentences, the true and the false, or at least the classic extensionalist. Obviously, there are other ways of developing extensionalism. If you're an extensionalist about sentence semantic values, you believe in a lot of substitutivity salva veritate. Intentionalists my main stalking horse here. They believe in quite a bit. I think way more than is plausible, right? If you know one necessary truth, you know them all. If you believe one necessary falsehood, you believe them all. But then, yeah, then there are moderate hyperintentionalists who don't believe in as much substitutivity, salva veritate, as the possible worlds intentionalist does, but they have quite a bit of substitution of different expressions across any kind of linguistic embedding, salva veritate, or at least any use embedding, right? So there are various ways of taking a string and sticking it in a bigger string and not preserving truth, but some of those are just kind of cheating, right? Thinking that the string cat turns up and concatenates, so I need a semantic theory where concatenate somehow some kind of a function of cats. That's a mistake, right? It's not just cutting and pasting syntax. It's something more, and we'll talk a little bit about what more it might be. Okay, so one tough case is entails. So Quine used to be very severe about anybody thinking entails is a sentential connective, right? Entails always has to be a two-place relation that takes names of strings as its substitution instances or quantifiers over them or something like that. But a lot of people realize that even if you try to talk that way, you keep slipping back into saying roses red entails that roses are red or blue. It keeps coming back into the object language. And once it does, entailment cuts pretty finely. So at least there can be necessary equivalence where one isn't a logical consequence of the other, right? That all water is H2O is not a logical consequence of all horses are horses, even if they're both necessary truths. If you do have a logic where those are logical consequences, then you might be able to find out a lot of necessary a posteriori truths just by doing some logic. But that doesn't seem right. Now, even logical equivalence, once you start talking about entailment in rival logics, there are various things, whatever the one true logic is or whatever the one true logics are, there are plenty of other logics that disagree about what follows from what. And at least when you're talking about entailment in logic such and such, if that's an object level construction, it can cut very finely indeed. So there's a logic that Bob Meyer and Errol Martin explored where A and A is not a logical consequence of A. So call that logic S, I think it's called. Roses are red entails in S that roses are red and roses are red. That's false. But that shows that roses are red has to have a different semantic value from roses are red and roses are red, which might not be bad news. You might have already thought that it had a different semantic value because of the kind of linguistic complexity of roses are red and roses are red. But anyway, it shows you've got to go a lot finer grained than whatever, in fact, logical equivalence requires. Because I do think roses are red is in fact logically equivalent to roses are red and roses are red. There are other cases where a lot of people want to go hyperintensional, but there are disagreements about how hyperintensional will go. So a lot of people now, I think, especially maybe in this audience, are tempted to think that some counterfactuals and some indicative conditionals are the sort of hyperintensional constructions. You can't substitute a necessary equivalent into the antecedent position or a necessary equivalent into the consequent position and guarantee saving truth value. After all, just finding out that the antecedent is necessarily false, if counterpossibles are non-trivial, that doesn't tell you whether the whole construction is true or false. But I suspect I'm up at the end, which kind of says that you can mess with a lot of things with sufficiently impossible antecedents. So furs and gorse, it's a stock example of two names for the same kind. It's a kind of spiky shrub found especially in England and Scotland, but in Scandinavia and various other places. Often you can take a sentence with furs in it and stick gorse in it and get something which has the same truth value. But in constructions like were furs distinct from gorse, then some furs would not be gorse. That's true. Were furs distinct from gorse, some furs would not be furs. I think that's false. Obviously, none of these examples get weird enough so that they often don't bowl me over with intuitive obviousness. But at least I can get in the mood of saying, okay, yeah, look, there could have been two kinds here, and that doesn't mean each kind is non-self-identical. It just means there's two kinds here. I think this is even more obvious with counterindicatives. So when I moved to Scotland, I knew about the first gorse case. There was this stuff all over the hills called whin, and it turns out whin is bloody furs and gorse again. It's just yet another word for the same thing, or at least close enough. And so I would think, look, if whin is furs, then it's gorse. Okay, that seems true. If whin is not furs, then it's not gorse. That's fine. If whin is not furs, then it's not whin. Not fine. So even though whin picks up the same kind as furs and gorse, doesn't look like it's substitutable everywhere in indicative constructions. And it's not just a philosopher's game to talk about this, because it's also the game of people learning Scottish English, right? So having various conjectures about whether this thing is the thing that I would use a different word for. So I think there's a lot of failure of, there are lots of things you might have thought were synonyms, and there are weird enough scenarios where, well, if they were different, then what? And you get non-trivial answers about what happens if they were different. And different non-trivial answers than if you just reuse the same expression twice. If Hesperus wasn't phosphorus, the philosophers and the astronomers would have all made a terrible mistake. If Hesperus wasn't Hesperus, well, I guess, maybe I want to blame the astronomers less for getting the facts about Hesperus wrong, right? It's like turned out to be a paradoxical object. But not necessarily, but maybe it wouldn't have been a paradoxical object if Hesperus and phosphorus had turned out to be different things. Propositional attitude reports. It's been known for a long time that there's lots of substitution you can't do, and substitution of necessary equivalence doesn't look very good. You can believe one necessary truth without believing them all. You can believe one necessary falsehood without believing them all. But even things you might have thought were synonymous, it's hard, right? So somebody who thinks, so pediatrician and podiatrist are two expressions in English. Pediatrician means a doctor for children. Podiatrist means a doctor for feet. But they're kind of similar. They get confused. Some people think pediatricians are foot doctors. But those very people don't think that pediatricians are not pediatricians, right? So if you think pediatricians are podiatrists, then you think child doctors are foot doctors if those were synonyms. Okay, maybe they're not synonyms, but you can, whether or not they are two different things, or even those words mean different things in English, doesn't give you much guidance about what people believe once you realize people can be confused. I think when you're describing the belief states of confused logic students, there are all kinds of obvious logical equivalences that you don't want to substitute inside the belief context, right? Maybe I know that not P follows from P, but a lot of them don't. And some of them know that not P follows from not P, but they don't know that not P follows from P. Rival logicians have very different beliefs. Take anything you think is logically equivalent. There's probably somebody in print who doesn't believe that they're logically equivalent and might well believe examples of one and not examples of the other. Belief is a mess. And not just belief. Once you notice this, then hopes that, or desires that, or is certain that. Expressions like that are very sensitive to near synonyms being substituted, or things you might have thought were synonyms. You can substitute and get problems in those kinds of cases. True in fiction F that. Again, I think you've got to kind of use, not just mention, but use the expression after that. Fictions can get pretty logically anarchic. So some people have claimed that for basically for any sentences we can understand, you could have a fiction where just those sentences are what's true according to that fiction. Certainly people have been playing around with various kinds of impossible fictions, ones where everything's true, ones where nothing's true. And you might take various things you might have thought were pretty hard to come apart, or even you might find it difficult to psychologically believe that somebody could believe one and not believe the other, but set up a fiction in the right way, and it might become plausible that one of those is true according to that fiction and the other one is not, right? A fiction about gods reaching in and mucking around with semantics, or gods reaching in and mucking around with logic, right? You might very well pick your two favorite alleged synonyms that are different sentences. You might well be able to get some suitably fiction of a suitably kind of surrealist genre where one is true according to the fiction and the other one is not. And that is not just that the negation of the other one's true according to the fiction, but that one, the second one, fails to be true according to the fiction. Finally, and there's lots to be argued about here, but things like said that and said explicitly that, you can say things which obviously are equivalent to something else without saying explicitly the second thing. Like Jill can say everybody in the room could be rewarded, and she might know and we might know that Mary was in the room. She hasn't said explicitly that Mary should be rewarded. It's an obvious inference from what she said. Again, once you start playing around with said explicitly that, you can get differences in all kinds of things that you might have thought were logically equivalent. One place that this has been a practical problem for me lately, I've been doing Duolingo, and it really isn't good enough to stick in a logical equivalent of what they think is the correct translation. You've got to say it in the right order. A and B does not translate the same way as B and A. Just doesn't. And so said that or translates or means that, there's in some contexts, very fine-grained differences will make a difference to whether a said that claim is correct or a means that claim is correct. The last one's a little bit cheeky. So people who don't like very fine-grained substitution often want to say, oh, well, you didn't use the two expressions, you mentioned one or the other. So people even tried this back in the day for belief attributions. So believes that, I guess Davidson thought the logical form of that was something like believes true that, and then you stick in a sentence. And to believe true that roses are red is to stand in a relation to some sentence that stands in some appropriate relation to the sentence roses are red. So people other than English speakers can believe that roses are red, but when Julius Caesar believed that roses are red, I think he came across some roses, he believed true that some sentence in Latin that's appropriately connected. So that's a popular and long-standing strategy for trying to deny that there's a lot of fineness of grain. But even when you look at quotation, the kind of thing that we would express in English, in written English with quotation marks, quotation marks do look kind of systematic, and they do look like something where once you're semantically competent with them, you're in a position to use them compositionally, use them on novel cases. It does look like there's a piece of semantic competence with these expressions. They turn strings of all kinds of semantic values into strings with, it's a function from those to strings that function like names. But it kind of it passes a lot of the tests for being semantic. Now, if quotation's semantic, then the semantic value of these little guys operates on the semantic value of the thing inside to give a semantic value of the type term or the type that names have, whatever that is. If quotation's semantic, then any failure of substitution within a quotation context is a failure of substitution salva veritate, which seems to have been produced by a substitution of something semantically significant. If that's true, then whenever you have two distinct strings, semantically distinct or syntactically distinct strings even, you won't get sameness of semantic value because they'll embed in quotation differently, right? Now, quotation's a complicated case, and what the thing in the quotation marks names can be all sorts of things depending on context. It doesn't always name the string. Sometimes it names the semantic value of the string. When you're quoting something, you're translating something quoted, you might translate it with a different word. Like if I write down India and you're translating that into French, you might write down Ind. Something funny is going on there, right? Somehow I get to mean the same. Well, if the translation's meaning preserving, I somehow mean something like India that can be meant by Ind, though obviously those two strings, open quotes, INDIA, close quotes, it can embed differently from open quotes, INDE, close quotes, right? India is a word of English, Ind is a word of French. India has 5 letters, Ind has 4 letters. So whatever's going on with quotation, there's a lot of ambiguity or context dependence or something going on as well. So it's a real mess. But if quotation, I'll at least make this claim, if quotation is semantic, then the prospects for cutting grain any finer than same string of letters looks doomed, right? Now, a lot of people want to say, well, obviously that's why quotation can't be semantic. And today I want to say, well, maybe we should ponens. Maybe meaning is very fine-grained. Semantic value is very fine-grained. Okay, so you're unlikely to have been convinced by all of those examples. Some of the messy examples are all I need. So what do we do? What do we do if we decide that distinct sentences nearly always have semantic differences that will show up under some embedding, right? Some suitable conditional embedding or some suitable propositional attitude embedding or some suitable said explicitly that embedding. You'll want a theory of meaning that allows for very subtle differences in the semantics for strings. So just associating each, so I'll focus mostly on the semantic values of entire sentences, but similar remarks will be able to go for predicates and names and other clauses and other kinds of parts of sentences too. Now, one way to do this is to pursue a sort of algebraic approach where every sentence just does get a semantic value, and then your entire theory of the interesting part of the theory of meaning is all the relationships that these values have, treat them as simples if you like, and put various relationships on them to give you the predictions about how embedding sentences in longer constructions gives you propositions. That's a very powerful and very flexible tool, but I'm going to set it aside because it's not how I'm used to thinking about things mainly. I concede it can do pretty much everything I want this next section to do. But my preferred way of going, maybe not surprising given the talk venue, is to keep a sets of worlds semantic value for sentences, but just include possible and impossible worlds. So Hesperus is in the sky. I'm happy to concede is necessarily equivalent to phosphorus in the sky, but they mean different things because, well, they're associated with different sets of worlds because there are impossible worlds where Hesperus is in the sky, but phosphorus is not in the sky. And if you're thinking, how could that be? They're the same object. Exactly. Can't be. Right. It's literally impossible. Don't worry. But nevertheless, impossible worlds, according to them, various impossible things happen. Now, if whenever we've got two sentences that we want to semantically put apart, we insist that there are some impossible worlds where one obtains and the other one does not, you can get a worlds model that can draw any distinctions you like. Right? There's furs on the hill, there's gorse on the hill. Luckily, there are plenty of impossible worlds where there's furs on the hill, but it fails to be that gorse is on the hill and vice versa. So the set of worlds where furs is on the hill is different from the set of worlds where gorse is on the hill. the set of worlds where not P is different from the set of worlds that are P. They agree on all the possible cases, but they disagree on various logically impossible cases. And so on, right? You want somebody to believe A without believing A prime. Yeah, the belief content worlds, some of the A worlds are not A prime worlds and vice versa. One way of modeling this, once you have a set of sentences of a language, is to have the worlds correspond to sets of those sentences and just let the sets be arbitrary. Or for today's purposes, you could insist that every set's complete once you've got a story about complete. I actually think arbitrary sets is the way to go, but if you want to insist on completeness for it to be a world, you can for today's purposes. But if whenever you've got two different sentences, they come apart at some impossible worlds, that's bound to draw all the distinctions you could want of meaning, right? Basically, that lets you model no two sentences of the language have the same meaning. Now, if that's all I say, it can feel fairly unsatisfactory. It's like, isn't this just some more syntax? I'm just associating I've got some sets of syntactic objects now as my semantics. What you can do that's a bit more interesting is you can impose conditions, or you can impose extra structure to get you results, more illuminating results. So in the case of counterpossible conditionals, I think there can be counterpossible conditionals. I like a very kind of traditional Lewis Stormacher style closest world semantics, A box arrow B, or if it were the case that A, it would be the case that B. That gets to be true at a world, provided the closest A worlds are B worlds. But where A is impossible, you can't just look at what's going on in the possible worlds to work out whether the closest A worlds are B worlds. And for sure, there'll be A worlds out there that are B worlds. There'll also be A worlds out there that are not, that fail to be B worlds. But the fact that the impossibilities are that abundant, there are extra facts about similarity or closeness of worlds to others. And so different models will disagree about whether A box arrow B is true, even when A is not true at any of the possible worlds, because of these extra facts, these closeness facts about how close various impossible worlds are to various possible worlds W. I didn't say possible worlds W. It's kind of important on that, if you're looking at the handout, that that's just the condition for the things being true at possible worlds W. Obviously, I think just like any other expression, counterfactuals can start misbehaving at impossible worlds. But if you want to know whether A box arrow B is true at a possible world W, it's whether the closest A worlds are B worlds. Closest A worlds to W are B worlds. And that's not trivial, even though it is trivial that somewhere out there there's an A world that's a B world, and also somewhere out there there's an A world that fails to be a B world. Okay, so that, again, that might not be complete news to people in this audience. If you're very generous with your impossible worlds, you get to draw all the distinctions you could want. If anything, the problem will be drawing more distinctions than you want. But at least today, I want lots of distinctions. So I'm feeling pretty good about letting impossible worlds be pretty arbitrary. Okay, so what's the problem? Well, if you don't think there's any problem, that's great. Maybe I should stop. Here's two kinds of concerns people have had with this kind of approach. So J.C. Bjerring and Wolfgang Schwartz, in a paper back in 2017, kind of object to this kind of approach, saying, look, it can't be very explanatory. Basically, I started off with a bunch of sentences, and I want a semantics for those sentences, and you gave back as the semantic objects arbitrary sets of those things, and told me that each sentence is associated with a set of these sets. Which set of these sets? Oh, the worlds where these sentences are true are the worlds that have these sentences as members. So basically, I've associated each sentence with a set whose members are sets, and this sentence S is in the corresponding set of worlds W, provided it is a member of all the worlds in that set of worlds. So basically, I've taken the sentences and handed back this more complicated set theoretic object, which corresponds one-to-one with the sentences. And at least the vibe of their paper is, thank you for that. How could that be explaining anything? You've just given me a mapping from sentences back to some complicated thing, which is basically the sentences again. Another kind of objection, Williamson has a wide variety of objections to trying to produce semantics that's hyperintentionally sensitive. And some of these are objections in specific cases, and some of them are more general. But again, the theme in a lot of the criticisms, though not all, is that once you give up the kinds of constraints, in effect, that say a possible world semantics would give you, you just get an underpowered theory. It doesn't make very many predictions. It doesn't tell you, it doesn't give you very many synonymies back. The more generous you are with the kinds of impossible worlds I like, the less structure you'll have, right? Give me two sentences, they mean different things. Okay, well, that's great. That's not a very powerful theory yet. Whereas if you insist on two sentences mean the same thing if they're necessarily equivalent, well, that gives you a lot more, gives you some structure anyway. Obviously, that doesn't do justice to everything that Williamson wants to complain about. But it is true that if you've got a semantics where each sentence gets a set of worlds, but the set of worlds can be pretty well badly behaved, right? They can all include P without it all including not P. They can all include A and B without it all including A. There's pick some bad behavior, you'll probably get those things coming apart that way. It does make it intractable for doing some of the cool things you could do with possible world semantics. So, for example, one thing you could do with possible world semantics is when you've got a theory and you want to add a proposition to that theory, you can take the intersection of the proposition expressed by the previous theory and the proposition expressed by the new one, and you'll get the proposition expressed by the two together. You can't just use mere old intersection anymore with impossible worlds, right? So I have all the A worlds and I want to add B. I won't get all the worlds where A and B anymore because basically some of the B worlds, I'll have some worlds where A obtains, B obtains, but A and B does not obtain. That's annoying. I won't throw out all of the worlds where A obtains and B does not, depending on how I'm doing these things, because I might still want, there's still impossibilities where A and B obtains where A does not, for example. So a lot of the things people were using more constricted models to do, you can't do those very easily anymore once you've got arbitrary impossible worlds, and arbitrary sentences tend to be associated with different propositions. Now, some of that I like, right? The problems I had with the powerful views where you do get results is those results have counterexamples, right? Having a powerful theory that generates lots of falsehoods, I don't think is really that great. And to be fair, my critics don't think that's great either, right? They want stories about how their theories aren't wrong as well. So what I would like to do is not have to rely on all of the flexibility and all of the distinctions that my preferred theory can draw in all of my semantic theorizing. Like, I might want a story about ground where I don't have to already have solved the problem of what happens with propositional attitude attributions. I might want a story about, want a story about what's knowable a priori, where I don't have to worry about various kinds of logical mistakes. Well, I do and I don't. What's in fact knowable a priori is sensitive to what kinds of logical mistakes you've made and what kinds of logical mistakes you're liable to make. But what's ideally knowable a priori, I'm happy to sometimes be able to idealize away. so that whenever you know A and B, you know A, right? I don't think that's true for confused logic students, but I do think it's true for idealized reasoners, for certain kinds of idealizations. So I want to defend a kind of pluralism. I want to say, look, if you're looking at all the models of the entire language, you will need all of these weird impossibilities where various things come apart that you might have thought go together. But you don't always have to use those, and you're legitimately not using them. Maybe this is kind of obvious, right? Like when I'm modeling logically omniscient agents, maybe I just want to use the logically possible worlds. Or, yeah, on the handout, when I'm modeling historical what-ifs, I might not want the logically impossible worlds. I might, or even some of the metaphysically impossible worlds. I might not want to worry about worlds where water isn't made of H2O. Maybe I need some of those worlds if I'm worried about what-ifs of chemistry, right? What if various experiments had gone different ways because the world was different from the way it chemically actually is? But lots of what-ifs of history, if I want to know what happened if there wasn't a sort of Napoleonic movement in the French Revolution, maybe I just don't need any of the metaphysically impossible worlds. And a lot of what we're doing in practice, whatever we say we're doing in theory, is working on these little toy models where we don't try to represent every dimension of variation that we believe in all at once. Okay, so that leaves a couple of questions unanswered. You might think, okay, well, that's nice. Everybody knows you can use toy models. That wasn't news, Nolan. I want to know what all the worlds are like. I want to know what semantics is like. I don't just want to know which models I can use when I'm dealing with little bits of it. And there I have to kind of say, yeah, it's messy. And almost every time you thought you had synonym, really you didn't. You had maybe something that was necessarily equivalent or logically equivalent, or maybe semantically necessarily equivalent, but weren't identical. So I want to leave you kind of with a metaphor about why this might not be crazy. And it's a contrast between traditional card games and a lot of new card games. So a traditional card game like poker or a particular variant of poker, you can kind of write down the rules on a piece of paper. You can maybe even specify what the cards are on a piece of paper, and you're good to go. You can write that down once and for all. With a lot of new games, like say Dominion, there are tons of cards. And the weird thing about some of the cards is they don't work like other cards work. Each card has its own little rules on it for how it works. And some of the rules influence how other cards work. So some cards, you can turn other cards into sort of cards that give you victory points by associating them with this card, even though the other card doesn't say anything about victory points on its own. And maybe language is more like a deck building game than like a game that you'll find in According to Hoyle or a traditional rule book. You've got a bunch of pieces of language that typically work in typical ways, but you've got special pieces of language that are sensitive to semantic things that a lot of the other language is not. Right? Propositional attitude descriptions, they're sensitive to lots of things about ordinary sentences that extensional contexts are not sensitive to, or even intensional contexts. Right? Maybe whenever necessarily P is true, take any necessary equivalent of P, and necessarily Q will also be true. But that doesn't mean believing P is the same as believing Q. Or grounding, right? Maybe not P and P kind of often function the same, but you can't substitute them salvo veritate and grounding claims if the logical grounding people are right. And so when I'm trying to give a theory of a total language, I basically have to give you the rules for every single card and how they affect all the other cards. And that's going to be big and messy. I don't think infinitely big and infinitely messy, but maybe we have hundreds of special words with hundreds of special constructions. And maybe the book of linguistics for English will have to be hundreds of chapters long, maybe thousands of chapters long if we're a little bit unlucky. That's big and messy, and it isn't simple and powerful and easy to do predictions from. But that doesn't mean that you can't use a lot of the language with a much shorter rulebook. Right? Maybe the semantic value for Jane runs has to be so sophisticated that it can embed in propositional attitude contexts and arbitrary counterpossibles and arbitrary weird pieces of language. But for lots of uses, Jane runs, you just need to know who Jane is and what running is and whether or not she's doing it. to kind of settle everything relevant to the truth condition of Jane runs. So that's the metaphor anyway, that there are these semantic features that are mostly the only things that are relevant, and then other semantic features of pieces of sentences that do turn up when you embed them in special things, like said explicitly that, or quotation, or counterpossibles. And that seems to me not an unappealing picture of how language might work. There's nothing stopping you introducing weird new little things into a natural language like English, particularly a natural language like English that seems to love introducing new weird little things. Just like you can speak a little dialect of English with slightly different syntactic rules, you can speak a dialect of English that has propositional attitude descriptions in it. And I think we need to work out how to be open to a lot of fine grain, however the debates about fine grain turn out, because it looks like it's sort of empirical questions. Question for investigatory linguistics, what features are semantically relevant to complex constructions. And a lot of theories to date in the cause of simplicity or in the cause of tractability have kind of insisted on semantic values where it looks like you can't do the embedding that natural language seems to do really easily, because your theory says that these two things have exactly the same semantic value. So they can't embed differently. And I think that's sometimes, maybe at the end of inquiry, we want to do that. But on the way to the end of inquiry, we want to at least be able to be open to, well, if two sentences we thought had the same semantic value have subtly different semantic values, how can we accommodate that in an overall theory of meaning without the whole thing crashing? And so I suspect we will have to do a lot of fine-grained accommodation, but I think even if you're not yet convinced of that, you might want to think about how we could do it if we had to, because inquiry might be unfriendly. It might tell us that English was more complicated than we hoped it was. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. So we have some time for questions. So let's start with Mirko Zambrota.
No, I didn't have a question. I just want to.
Oh, that was.
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
Oh,
all right, sorry.
Just clapping.
All
But
right.
I'm thinking about something.
Okay, so now we have time for questions. So please just raise your hand or. Okay, Carrie.
Thanks for that, Daniel. That's super fun. I'm probably not your target audience because I was already just like, oh yes, obviously impossible world, blah blah blah. At the beginning, but trying to channel a little bit of the folks who will worry about this. I think it might help me just to kind of see the fit. So if we were to take these ideas about the pluralism of models and then sort of step through the explanatory and virtuousness explanations. So I see why this helps with the underpoweredness, right? So we're getting lots of power, I suppose, from this Dominion style deck. What do you want to say to the explanatoriness worry and the virtuousness worry?
Yeah, so so I wanted to concede that the total story is a big, complicated mess. So the semantic values, even of some pretty boring sentences, have to be kind of fancy because they could be embedded, or the total semantic kind of package of a boring sentence, because it can be embedded in propositional attitude constructions, because I have to talk about what people are certain about when the paradox monger is using the sentence in front of them. I want to kind of say, look, I want to sort of divide and conquer. I want to say, look, for some ordinary purposes, like even an extensional semantics for a sentence like Jane runs might be fine, right? Even if the total semantic value of Jane runs has to be something fairly complicated, because let's say Janie is another name for Jane, then but it doesn't follow that anyone who believes Jane runs believes that Janie runs, because they might have only met Janie at work and kind of she didn't seem like a runner. Yeah, so I kind of want to say, look, I can use these simple models that make tons of predictions, and those are supposed to have most of the virtues that my opponent thought semantics had to have. But the problem I think their views have is they've got counterexamples, they're false. And my big fancy complex thing doesn't treat Jane runs and Janie runs as synonyms. And so when I get to the propositional attitudes, I'm not stuck with thinking, well, they'd better be substitutable, salvo veritate.
Yeah.
That was a bit
That's
hand wavy,
cool. So,
because I'd left the
no, I think
hand wavy.
yeah. Can I ask a little more about it? I get that shape of that much better now, which is helpful. So is a fair way of putting it to say, yes, there's some unvirtuousness about the full deck. However, look at my small deck. It has the virtues you thought the semantics was supposed to have, which doesn't solve all of the unvirtuousness of the full deck, but it explains why you expected more virtues. Because this is what's necessary for most of these kinds of tasks, something like that.
Good, yeah. Along with, I have explanations similar to the ones you wanted in the cases where you wanted explanations. So if Williamson's worry was, once you've got this much flexibility, you've got lots of the semantic connections I wanted, you don't really have in full generality. I'm like, well, but I've got it in generality enough when the pieces of language being used aren't the tricky ones.
Right. Look at my Newtonian mechanics style attempt to explain, like, the baby logic stuff. Yeah. Cool.
Good,
That helps a lot. Thanks. And the Bering and Schwartz one.
Yeah. So, two things I wanted to say there. One was, look, the structures I'm putting on the worlds are doing a lot of the explaining. So, for example, the set of worlds associated with the sentence S is the set whose all its members have S as a member. So that was sort of 1-1 in a kind of boring way. But whether the worlds in that set are close to or far away from the actual world, that wasn't specified just by the range of worlds, right? That's an extra relation on the worlds that's doing semantic work. So that was part of the explanation. It was part of they missed some of the explanatory heavy lifting. But the other part was, when I'm using all the impossible worlds, they're right about every sentence gets a different set of worlds and it's all chaos. When I'm throwing out most of the impossible worlds to do my limited explanatory work, that's just not true anymore, right? That there might be no worlds now where P and not P are true, because I'm doing historical counterfactuals and I'm not considering any. It's not the counterfactual history of logic. It's just the counterfactual history, say, of the Napoleonic Wars or something. And now there are no So basically, in my limited applications, their complaint about the mapping just turns out to not be true anymore, because I've thrown out most of the impossible worlds. But these are really helpful questions, yeah, because I didn't return to the objections to say.
Yeah, no, it's helping me a lot to see how it addresses both of those. And so, like, is it fair then to say, really, people need to think about this as, when you're using some of the sort of, all worlds quantification, just understand that that's a restricted quantifier. We're talking about all the worlds that are within, this subdeck of the, and we have certain ones that are appropriate to certain kinds of tasks. So our baby logic one, or maybe we have one that's like really good at counter possibles, and so those restrictions also feel fairly natural. They're not going to be just, arbitrary additional structures that you're imposing. There's good reasons why we have those. Those are good decks to play with for these different sorts of purposes.
Good, yeah, and that brings out something that I should have said explicitly, but I think sometimes when people are worried about a lack of unity or a lack of virtue, what they have in mind is each new expression I have a completely different technical toolkit, right? So I'm kind of probabilistic about conditionals, and I'm expressivist about ethical vocabulary, and I'm dynamic semantics about permissions, and I'm something else about this other thing. And then I turn up with 50 gadgets, and I'm like, I can handle 60% of our language now. What I was hoping with the sort of deck building analogy is you can kind of see how the limited decks do relate to a game where every single card is in play by kind of subtraction of worlds, basically. And so I'm also hoping that it's more unified and more systematic than some model pluralists who just want to be like, I just want a piece of formalism or piece of machinery that gets me through this expression, and then no story really about how they all work together.
Awesome. Thanks very much.
Cool.
Maciej, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. It was really really nice. I have even though I have a lot of sympathy, I would like to raise some, let's say, devil's advocate.
Yeah, please do.
So, for I understood, the idea here is that, well, now when we are doing hyperintensional semantics, we should not take into consideration the whole set of worlds, but rather some kind of subsets of this particularly relevant worlds. So my first question would be, I mean, it seems to me that someone who would like to argue against this might want to say that, well, so how do we know what kind of worlds should we be interested in this particular case without going into ad hoc position, so to speak? Whereas in case of, merely possible worlds semantics, or in the standard impossible world semantics, we don't have to care about this kind of questions. So that would be one question. And the other one is kind of related to Duolingo thing that you mentioned. So, and to Schwartz and Bering paper. So for all I remember, they argued that, well, we should be really careful not to mess semantics with syntax, right? So we want to have really fine-grained distinctions, but not the one that boils down to syntax. And the reason for this is that, well, even though there might be some contexts where this is helpful, like let's say Duolingo, right, where A and B is not the same as B and A, there's a lot of context where we don't want to go towards this direction. So now I'm thinking whether it's possible, in your view, to actually extend the domain of worlds to include even those where, the identity failed to hold, and really, really bizarre worlds. And at the end of the day, just to say, yeah, I mean, there are such worlds, but we are not interested in them as long as we are not doing Duolingo or whatever, right? So in this sense, this set of impossible worlds became really, really fine-grained, so to speak, right? So yeah, so those two questions.
Yeah, good. So the which worlds do we keep and which worlds do we throw out? That's going to be really hard to answer in full generality because there's so many projects. But I guess I feel like I have a grip of it in particular cases, like say the historical counterfactuals about the 18th century. Maybe I just want to insist, look, I'm only interested in logically coherent histories. Maybe I could, and whether I want to mess with the metaphysical necessities might depend a little bit on my project. Like, you might sort of believe in the necessity of origin, but be like, oh no, but I want to consider cases where Napoleon was the son of Louis XVI. Right? To what extent was it Napoleon's genius, and to what extent was it his social position that helped explain how he came to be running France? And then you might just say, well, look, I don't even care whether the metaphysicians say necessity of origin is true or not. I want to consider those scenarios. Yeah, and I feel like, so the rough story is going to be, look, most of the metaphysical necessities I want to mess with. Most of the gnomic necessities I don't want to mess with. I mean, maybe I need to mess with some, like maybe say it turns out surprisingly that our kind of Big Bang couldn't have produced, I don't know, worlds where how much you needed to survive as a French peasant was very different. I don't think that's likely, but I kind of even if it's true, I want to ignore the nomic impossibility of some scenarios where the peasants needed much less food. If I'm doing some kind of, resource explanation of the French Revolution or something. Yeah, so maybe I should leave it there because I feel like I don't have a short story in principle about which ones to leave out, which ones to include.
So it would be something like, let's say, context sensitivity when we are talking about counterfactuals, meaning that we are just narrowing down to, contextually relevant worlds, right? Or something like that.
Yeah, but it's kind of doing that twice over. So
Yeah.
if you included kind of all the worlds that any antecedent could take you to, a lot of them will be too far away to make a difference to a lot of ordinary counterfactuals. But I was thinking a limited modeling project where I just cut most of those out and they're not even in my model, that won't make any difference when I'm dealing with the very limited range of counterfactuals. I guess the other thing I was thinking was which worlds I include might depend a bit on which constructions are in my toy language or in the piece of the language that I'm interested in. So once I've got propositional attitude reports in the language, I might need a whole bunch of impossibilities. If it's just a language about which pixels are lit up and which pixels are not lit up, then maybe I could just even leave out the modal and temporal distinctions and stuff like that and just have a kind of set of pixel distributions or something as the worlds that I'm interested in. So which pieces of language you're using is going to be a guide, but that's going to leave open some theoretical questions. Like people will disagree about how hyperintensional various pieces of language are. And yeah. So your second question, I also wanted to address Bering and Schwartz are very keen on something's gone wrong if semantic is collapsed into syntax. Sure, syntax is fine, and A and B is a different syntactic object from B and A, but I think the way they do it, they kind of, it's almost a reductio if you want to draw a semantic distinction between those two. And yeah, I guess I want to go with reductio and say, well, no, I need a semantic distinction because means that is an expression we have in English, or translates is an expression that we can is a sentence connective, and roses are red and violets are blue translates violets are blue and roses are red. The little owl told me that was wrong, so I just do need to distinguish A and B and A semantically now. Yeah, but then the using limited models thing is kind of recapture stuff. For lots of purposes, I want to treat A and B the same way as I treat B and A. And so even though my official complete semantics of English, those two things are not synonyms, they have different semantic values. When I'm not doing the complete semantics of English, but I'm doing the semantics of explanation, for example, maybe everything that A and B explains, B and A explains, and vice versa, and on the other side, it explains that as well. And so when I'm doing that project, then I just leave out all the worlds where A and B obtains, but B and A fails to obtain. Then I do assign them the same semantic value for that limited project. But I can explain what I'm doing because I'm leaving out some of the distinctions that the full theory of English would require. So I'm sort of trying to bite the bullet and explaining why it's not so bad for the Bering and Schwartz objection on that point.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree that, if you add more subsets, so to speak, and you introduce kind of a labor division, then it seems perfectly fine to say that, well, we don't care about those tricky examples because they're irrelevant for the thing that we want to do, right? We don't care about hammer when we are doing something else. So yeah, thanks.
Cool, thanks.
Right, next I can see Jace.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me, Daniel?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the talk. I think this might be picking up from this is actually going to be picking up from the first question that the previous questioner asked. So I like the pluralism of models view, and but I keep getting tripped up on, when you're modeling phenomenon X, right? How is it that you go about deciding, okay, which set of possible worlds are we going to choose to do this? Like, is there an in-principled way of trying to of saying, okay, when you've got phenomenon X, it's gonna be this set of worlds. When you've got phenomenon Y, it's gonna be that set of worlds, and blah 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 blah. And I don't know. I was just I know that this is going to be like, this is a big question, and so I was just wondering if you have, I don't know, anything that to maybe like a hint of what might help us to decide, because I was kind of thinking about this in terms of like what you might say or what you could say, and something that I was thinking you can feel free to comment on this is, I was thinking of the properties debate between sparse and abundant properties, right? You've got this phenomenon, cache it in terms of natural and unnatural properties. So you're going to use naturalness here to kind of help you. So when you've got the phenomenon of qualitative resemblance, that's going to tell you, hey, we're going to postulate perfectly natural properties to help us out with that, the natural properties, the sparse ones. And when you get to other sorts of phenomena, you're going to get less natural, right? So I was wondering if that sort of story might be, I don't know, some sort of story like that might be helpful. And maybe you want to appeal to sort of semantic competence or something there to help out with that. So yeah,
good
thoughts on that.
So maybe talking about kind of a specific debate might help more than trying to give a completely general answer, because I feel like the very general question can come across like, how do we produce the correct theory of semantics? And like, well, cool, that's a big question. But say I'm interested in belief attributions. So not even all propositional attributions, just belief attributions. And there's a live debate about whether everybody who believes A and B also believes B and A. And I'm tempted to say no, but there are plenty of people in the literature who say yes. How do we make progress at that point? Well, one thing to do is to either ask questions or look at corpuses of competent belief attributors. Does anybody ever attribute A and B but hold off on B and A? Another thing to do is to look at the range of weird debates that happen, right? So I don't know the names off the top of my head, but I think there are some logicians around who don't think conjunction commutes. And so they even think sometimes A and B is true without B and A being true. If I could find one of them in the journals, I might be like, well, that's a piece of evidence that not everyone who believes A and B automatically believes B and A, because that person has this kind of theoretical reason for drawing a distinction most people don't draw. And so it feels to me it's kind of that level of inquiry that will tell me whether the belief worlds I want in my semantics for propositional attitude ascription, whether there are any that have A and B in them but fail to have B and A in them. And that's not a very big picture general story about that, but that's how I'd try to make progress on that issue about that topic. And then the big question of, do I want any purposes for where I have A and B, but I don't have B and A? Well, that's the kind of the question is there an application of explaining semantic competence where those two don't substitute salva veritate? Does that answer the question, the kind of generality you wanted, or am I kind of, everything's frozen? Maybe I've dropped out.
I think that does help. I wasn't, I shouldn't have asked such a general question. I wonder if it would probably be better, as you said, to just look at specific examples, like take, propositional attitude reports and, I don't know, quotation or counter possibles. And you're dealing with counter possibles and propositional attitude reports. Now, here, there's something about those two phenomena that's going to trigger certain sets of impossible worlds that the other one's not. And so you might go, well, what is it about those two phenomena that's going to trigger that? So.
Yeah, and I think so. One question is sort of there are going to be controversies about what gets triggered, right? So, I mean, there are still people holding the kind of possible worlds line, and some of them are going to be saying, "Look, propositional attitude reports never trigger any impossible world." So Tim Williamson has a kind of recent O'Kentness paper where he's kind of holding the line there, which is kind of useful for my purposes as having a foil who really is saying the stuff that sounds like it's the straw man. But then even once we've all agree on which ones get triggered, there's this question about why those ones got triggered and why not other ones. And then the flat-footed response is, oh, well, that's the semantic function of that expression. Now I can try to give you a story about why we might have an expression like that in the language, or why it might have retained that semantic function once there was a piece of language. So I could start giving a kind of socio-linguistic story about.
Mm-hmm.
So one way of trying to explain it would be, why is it helpful to have propositional attitude reports that march so closely to differences in English sentences? And maybe that's helpful because, yeah, people do react to different sentences differently. And so, if somebody is really committed to some distinction that I don't really recognize, I need to be sensitive of that when I'm talking to them, and I need to report to my friends that they're sensitive to that. So there's those kinds of explanations. So I guess I'm thinking, in one sense, the story is, well, that's just the semantic value of that expression. But then there's an expression. Yeah, then there's an explanation to be given of why is there an expression like that, why it doesn't decay into something more fine-grained or less fine-grained.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not saying I'm very good at sociolinguistics. I'm not sure I'm the person to ask for those explanations, but.
All right, thank you.
All right, Chitai.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So, my question is kind of related to the last question. So I'm wondering that it is right to think that our belief apparatus is the typical way to determine the restrictions of the set of the impossible worlds. And if that is true, then can I understand that the semantic values are partly determined by our beliefs? And if that is the case, then do you still commit to semantic externalism like a lot of other people, or do you not commit to that? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, good. So I hope that the contents of belief will have a lot to do with it. I do like kind of head-first stories, maybe something like, it's our collective understanding of conventions we've set up, or something like that, which kind of makes it the case that our utterances have one set of semantic values rather than another. I do want a fair amount of semantic externalism, I think, because I think there's sort of both deference and the kind of whatever it turns out to be sorts of intentions in the collective understanding about what our conventions are. So I don't mind the story where we sort of agreed that if there's interesting real commonalities in the chemistry of different water samples, then the way to classify new samples is whether or not they have that chemical feature, right? So which gives me, so I interpret people before modern chemistry talking about what people in medieval epics talking about water. I think the extension of their expression included a whole bunch of cases of H2O that they wouldn't have never heard of. So I guess I want that sort of explaining the externalism in more internalist friendly sort of terms. But I hope a lot of the picture I presented today, somebody could endorse even if they didn't like that, right? So even if they thought, however language gets its meaning, it's not via mental states of its users, maybe because they think our characterization of the mental states is sort of language downstream of the language or something. So I hope this picture will be appealing to people with other sort of metasemantic approaches. But for what it's worth, yeah, my metasemantic approach is a lot more headfirst, convention-y. Insofar as there's externalism, it's because of implicit conventions about what we're going to let things depend on and stuff like that.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Okay, I think I've got a small question, probably related to Maciej's as well as Jay's question. So I was just wondering, so this is about the pluralism of models. It seems like, or what do you think about having like two different sets of worlds, be it possible or impossible worlds, explaining the same phenomenon, but in a different way? So the example would be, so there is a recent book of J.C. Beale who tries to kind of accommodate contradictions in God, right? And you have two distinct views. You've got a kind of consistentialism view, which says that, look, the set of possible worlds is enough to explain apparently contradiction in God. And J.C. says, no, we need kind of contradictory worlds. Now it seems like they have two different sets of worlds, but they do kind of different ideological machinery in order to explain a contradiction in God, right? So on kind of possibilist side, they say, well, possible worlds doing in this way, you have to buy some piece of ideology to explain contradiction of God by set of possible worlds. And you've got a rival who says, no, we need impossible worlds because that explanation is more simpler, more systematic, and stuff like that. So I was wondering if you can have two different sets of worlds, be it possible or impossible worlds, aiming at the same problem.
Yeah, so very short answer is yes. I guess there's two different ways that could be working, and I'm more comfortable with the first way than the second way. So the first way is there's a genuine disagreement. The two sides are committed to different ontologies. They both have explanations that work pretty well. Maybe they're not. Maybe one side's right and one side's wrong, or maybe both sides are wrong. But they believe in different semantic objects, but they do similar work and can get you to a similar place. That might be a bit like, say, two classical physicists, and classical physicist 1 only believes in fields and classical physicist 2 only believes in particles, but they can do a lot of things that the other one can do. And then there's a second way, which is kind of the ideal explainer would use both sets of objects, or could go back and forth between both sets of objects. And that feels... So my first reaction to that is that feels unnecessarily complex. So David Lewis used to say, buying a donkey and doing the walking yourself. It's like, why not just pick the one set of objects that does explaining the best in an overall way, and then reject the rival semantic approach because it did worse. But there's another one, but I'm sympathetic to it in another way, which is I think sometimes what we say about our theoretical posits underspecifies which piece of ontology we're talking about. So I mean, maybe neither of these cases are right, but you could think functions are primitive sets of primitive ordered pairs, or you could think that they are sets of unordered pairs where the first thing, we're just taking the singleton of the first thing together with the second thing. Or you could think the sets of unordered pairs where you take the singleton of the second thing and just the first object and the singleton of the second object. And it could well be that some kind of structural story is right, and there's some number of candidates in set theory which all exist and which are all perfectly respectable, and some function talk didn't pick out which one they were interested in, or didn't pick out in full specificity which one. And I bet that goes on with possibilities and possible worlds too. Whatever they are, at least a lot of our appeals to worlds aren't super specific.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And at least for some projects, maybe not when we're sitting in the metaphysics classroom trying to think about the metaphysics of worlds, but some projects when I'm using worlds, are they sets of sentences? Are they sets of propositions? Are they big conjunctive propositions? Are they something else? Maybe I just didn't say enough, and all of those objects model a phenomena perfectly well. So, it was sort of unspecified which ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody who is thinking about it and thinking about each of those options kind of more specifically might say, hey, there are 4 different ways of doing this. I could use set of objects 1, or set of objects 2, or set of objects. And an expert who's explaining with different bunches of objects because they have that kind of approach to the explanation, that seems fine, right? Surely there is a fair bit of underspecification, and when there is, which specification you pick might not matter.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry, that was a more complex answer than the question was. But
you're right. Yeah, thank you. Very good. Okay, we've got 1 more minute for last question, last note. All right, so unless there is no more questions, so let me just thank again Daniel for a fantastic talk.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been great.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you all for coming, and just stay tuned for another talk, which will be September 19th, but I'll distribute all the information, so you'll find the update very soon. So thank you again for coming, and I'll see you very soon.
Great. Thanks so much, Martin. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Daniel, have a good day.
See ya.